Dune Part 2 hit theaters last weekend. Does it still have an impactful message for today? Well, yes and no. Hi, you're watching This, That, and Theology, equipping you to see your worldview in the world around you. The first film awed me at how it was able to capture the size and the scale of Frank Herbert's classic novel. However, just like the first movie, the second movie suffers from the problem that it's really hard to take a lot of esoteric dialogue and inner monologue and put this on screen. Dune is one of those films that many people said was unfilmable. Not necessarily just because of the events of the film, because the events with modern technology were actually able to do. In 1984, they tried, and that film, while it does have some nostalgic charm to it, I love seeing Patrick Stewart in that film, for instance, it's not really a film that captures much of the book's essence. In fact, some of the things they did because of their technological limitations, while interesting and creative choices for the time, really miss a lot of what makes Dune special. When you saw the part 1 and part 2 together, what you're seeing is a description of the events in cinematic language that is breathtaking. You really believe the world that Frank Herbert created is a real one that's tactile and visceral. You can see how everything fits together, at least on scale. I remember one of the scenes from the first movie when you looked up from the planet and saw that giant navigator ship, and I was like, wow, they really do understand the scope of what this book was like. Very few books captured my imagination as well as Dune did, and very few movies have reflected the things that my own brain created quite as well as these wonderful Villeneuve films. There's a reason why people are talking about these as being the best films of the year. Cinematography is great. The score by Hans Zimmer is absolutely fantastic. The performances by the actors actually are convincing. You really do feel like they're real people. So as far as a cinematic movie goes, there's a lot of positive things to be said about Dune. There are a few moments where if you're not familiar with the books, however, you do get a little lost. And that's because Frank Herbert's Dune isn't really about the events that happen. The betrayal of the Atreides family, the Harkonnens' evil, all of those things are happening in a context of a world that unfortunately you really can't communicate inside the film. As far as content goes, there's not a whole lot to be concerned about in this film other than violence, and there is a lot of violence. This is in some ways a war movie, and there are some behaviors that you see that are quite honestly pretty despicable. The Harkonnens are very evil, and they've managed to capture that fairly well, even if most of what you see of their evil is off screen. While there is a little bit of mild sensuality between Chani and Paul, for the most part it's only implied and it's kept fairly tame. We've come a long way in storytelling since 1984, and so every element that you see actually feels believable. The visual effects are done incredibly well. In fact, instead of using green screen like I'm using for this video, the director used something I believe he calls sand screen. He changed the color so that even the way lights reflected from those backgrounds were believable. You really get drawn into this world. You believe it. Even the size and the scope of the giant sandworms, you realize this is a living, breathing ecosystem. But again, the greatest strength of Frank Herbert's Dune isn't in the events that happen in this book, but rather the ideas that are being taught. You do get a few references to those in both the first and the second part, but you're really missing out on the whole scope. Frank Herbert was a big advocate of the human mind. He wanted people to think and to think for themselves, which is why in the world of Dune, any thinking machine, any computer, any artificial intelligence has been banned. In fact, it's part of the religion of the era that you are not supposed to make any machine that can do the work of a human mind. So even though you see mentats and Bene Gesserits and navigators and imperial conditioning and all of these issues that you see in the books, even though they're referenced in the films, you don't really understand what they are or why they're important. Mentats have essentially challenged their brain and grown in their way of thinking, so they're essentially a human computer. It's referenced in the first book, it's completely missed in the second one, and it's never at all mention that Paul himself was trained as a mentat. The Bene Gesserits are seemed something like the Dune version of Jedi, with mind powers and highly trained bodies so that they can do martial arts like never before seen. But you miss the whole fact that they have been using politics as their mode of control for 10,000 years. The navigators are barely referenced, and so the massive navigator ships and the import of why spice is needed in order to make travel across the galaxy possible is completely missed. Because what you also see in this world that Herbert has created is an entire society that spans planets across the galaxy that's all hooked on drugs. And the most potent of all of those drugs is the spice melange, the stuff that can only be found on Arrakis, on the planet of Dune. So this dependency on the thing that Paul can control by destroying, and you do hear one of his famous lines, that he who can destroy a thing controls a thing. Even though you have those references, you don't understand the worldview that is being presented in the books, and you don't have the argument against society today. Think of how much we rely on computers and the internet to do our day-to-day things. People aren't learning how to speak foreign languages or study ancient languages because we have excellent resources that we can find just online. You don't have to guess about what voice actor is voicing a particular character in an animated film, because with a few clicks on your phone, you have the entire cast list and whatever else you may have seen them in. We don't have to train our minds to recall important information because we have machines that'll do it for us. I love the fact that I can open my phone, and if I'm curious about any topic, I can find a wealth of information about it. But I don't necessarily have the same recall. I'm realizing that for my own self, there's a certain amount of recall that's missing because I'm able to just pull up my phone. Think also of how many hours per day were spent in front of screens. One of my favorite books is The Count of Monte Cristo. This book is massive. It's about 1,200 pages if it's a good small print, and it usually takes me a few months to go through. Most people today don't know how to read that. In fact, most of what people are reading today are synopses or something that we can skim over the internet. And studies have shown that we actually read information on a screen differently than we do from a book. The world that Frank Herbert imagined, where we have let machines do the thinking for us, is one of reality. And many other science fiction authors saw this as a concern as well. If you look at George Orwell's book 1984, one of the big concerns that he had was the ability for people to have their history rewritten based on whoever was in power. It's not that different from what Frank Herbert was concerned about when he said that those who are reliant upon thinking machines, those who control them, control the people. Even as we look at our world today, we see our own history being rewritten by those who are in social and political power. So the question that I started with about whether Dune is actually something that is relevant for today is both yes and no. Yes, I think that Frank Herbert's Dune, as dense as the book is, should be an essential reading for anyone who's interested in seeing how science fiction can help us understand our world today. In fact, I did a whole video about that on our last live stream about why everyone should read science fiction, and Frank Herbert's Dune is right up on the top of that list. That being said, the film misses most of those really important things. While it's a spectacle that's enjoyable to watch, that's relatively clean, even though there is a significant amount of violence and combat, again, it is a war movie, for the most part, it's fairly sanitized. It's violent, but there's not blood splatters everywhere. The Fremen are a violent people and very good at what they do, and you see lots of explosions and lots of combat, and because in this futuristic world, weaponry is often relegated to swords and knives, there's a whole lot of stabbing going on as well. So as a visual spectacle, Dune is fantastic. I really enjoyed it, but I think I enjoyed it more because I understood the story. I understood what was going on and the elements of that science fiction story that we didn't necessarily see on screen, but are definitely going on underneath. There are going to be people who absolutely love this film, and there are also going to be people who just don't understand it. Imagery is fantastic. Score is phenomenal. The actors do a fantastic job of portraying the characters that they are charged with. However, the essential elements of science fiction that make Dune the masterpiece that it is, well, those are largely missing. Hopefully this has been helpful, and if you are interested on why I think science fiction is essential, again, I'll put a link to that video segment right in the description below. Make sure you liked and subscribed. We go live almost every week on Friday mornings at 10 a.m. Mountain Standard Time. If you're subscribed and you've hit that notification bell, you'll get to see when we're going live every week. Thanks for watching, and I hope you have a great week. See you next time.
He who can destroy a thing has the real control of it.